En vivo.
Okay. So shall we start now? Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. We are very happy to have Paulina Oliva present today in this joint seminar with EFD and LAERE. We are very happy to have everyone join us to talk about the vehicles, travel demand and income, responses to subways and bus rapid transit in Mexico City. And I will briefly introduce Paulina, even though I know that many people here know her. Paulina is an associate professor of economics and spatial science in the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts and Sciences at the University of Southern California. She specializes in the fields of environmental economics and development. In particular, she is interested in the relationship between air pollution and health and on environmental policy effectiveness in the developing world. Her work uses a variety of microeconometric techniques to study individual incentives and human impacts of air pollution. Paulina Oliva's research shows that high levels of air pollution can be especially lethal to vulnerable population in low and middle income countries such as Mexico, China, India, and Brazil. And her current research is taking a closer look at what socioeconomic characteristics such as education, access to healthcare, initial health status can determine why these populations are more susceptible to the effects of air pollution. Her research today will be about Mexico City transportation, and I would like to say that she's also an amazing co-author. So Paulina, without anything else to say, the floor is yours. Jorge will be moderating. We welcome all. We welcome clarification questions throughout the presentation, but at the end, we will have 15 minutes at the end for additional questions. So if your question is more in depth, we ask you to wait for it till the end. And without anything else to say, Paulina, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dana. And as Dana said, she is a co-author in this paper. So, you know, all the credit is to her for all her work on this as well. So I'm super happy to be here. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for the invitation. This is joint work also with Chris Severin, who's at the Fed and may or may not be in the audience. I didn't see. Yeah, so let me get us started with a little bit of motivation. So as Dana said, this paper is about the introduction of new forms of transportation in Mexico City and what happens to demand. So first, let me start by looking at some statistics about vehicle adoption in different countries. And how does it correlate with income? So as we know, there is a very strong correlation between the number of individuals that use vehicles as their primary mode of transportation and per capita income. So what I'm showing you here are some statistics from the World Bank that show the different countries as of 2014, and that red arrow is pointing towards Mexico, so you can see that it's right in the middle. So sort of the theme of the next slides that I'm going to show is this very strong correlation over time and with income of vehicle adoption, but also I want you to pay a little bit of attention to the heterogeneity in vehicle adoption, even for a given level of income. And the reason why I want to draw attention to this is because as emissions rise and as both air pollution and climate change are concerns that are attached to private vehicles, we want to know what forms of transportation will help us better, will help with reducing the rapid adoption of vehicle as a mode of transportation and increase the use of more effective sources of transportation, even among the higher brackets of income. So that's sort of what we would like to better understand. So this shows what has happened to vehicle adoption over time.
Sorry, Paulina, for interrupting you.
Sure.
May you share the full screen just to improve
Yes.
the presentation image? Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I didn't realize I wasn't doing that yet. Perfect. Is that better?
Yes. but maybe you I don't know if you can have the chance to put in a fuller screen. So
yeah, is that I have full screen right now.
okay.
Is that not showing?
No.
Huh.
You try Control L.
About now?
No.
Let's see.
Maybe we Control L, please. Could be.
Let me see if it's showing here. How about that now?
Perfect.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the note. I forgot about that. Minimal detail. All right. So now we're looking at what's happening over time in these different countries. And what you can see here is that both across income and over time, there's quite a bit of increased adoption of vehicles, of private vehicles. But the other thing that is important to note here is that that there's quite a bit of variation. So if you can compare, for example, for a given level of income, the countries like Sweden or Japan, in countries like the US, you can see that even under very high income per capita, we see substantial heterogeneity in terms of car ownership and car usership. So, and one more quick slide of motivation, and then we'll talk a little bit about the case of Mexico City. This is also showing motor vehicle use trends with income, and also in this particular graph, we're showing transport sector share in CO2 emissions. So one of the big concerns of having increased usership of vehicles is that with that comes obviously greenhouse gases and air pollution. And you can see that because of this increased use of vehicles, as incomes increase, the share of emissions that can be attributed to the transport sector also increases. So these are sort of the motivating factors for why we would like to learn a little bit more about how do we end up, how in Latin America specifically, how do we end up in a trajectory that's closest to what we see in Japan or within the US as New York, as opposed to the US or within the US, Los Angeles. So is Mexico City going towards New York or LA? And how can public transportation interventions can help us go on one track or the other? So this is the main question that we want to answer with this paper. What are the effects of public transit interventions in Mexico City on driving? And more specifically, we want to know whether there are specific public transport interventions. In this specific case, I'm talking about new forms of transportation, such as the BRT, that have different effects on adoption of vehicles. And what is the heterogeneity of adoption across the different income groups? Are we motivating individuals in higher income groups to adopt these new forms of transportation by making them more accessible, or making public transportation more accessible? So these are the questions that I want to answer today. And let me give you a little bit of background of Mexico City, and then I'll give you the short answer to these questions, or a brief summary of the results. Mexico City is a mega city that's growing rapidly. It has the second largest subway in the Western Hemisphere, and has presented growing automobile use in the last couple of decades. The biggest increase has happened in the first of these two decades. As of 2010, we have about 267 vehicles per 1,000 individuals. These, of course, comes along with congestion and pollution that are two big problems of Mexico City, as of many other large cities in the world. So what are the interventions that we're going to study in this specific paper? We're looking at added lines to the subway, which, as I said before, is the second largest subway in the Western Hemisphere. So before 1994, it already had 9 lines. It's a very rich network. And after 1994, added 3 more lines. and the introduction of a new form of transportation that has become very popular among developing countries. As we know, Colombia has Transmilenio, which has been very, very well studied as well. And the BRT was introduced in Mexico City first in the early 2000s, added the first line, and then in the late 2000s, in the last decade, added 5 more lines for a total of 6 lines. So what we want to learn is whether there are differences in how individuals use these forms of transportation compared with vehicles. So we want to know whether the specific mode of rapid transit, and by rapid transfer, I'm going to be referring to these 2 modes of transportations, whether there are differences in terms of how individuals substitute towards vehicle use in a way from public transportation with respect to these two forms. And the other thing that we want to look at is whether there's any heterogeneity across income in the use of these forms of transportation and how people substitute away from vehicles. And I'm going to give you the short answer to these questions before I dive into the bulk of the paper, just in case I don't get to discuss the results in detail. What we find is that proximity to stations of either of these 2 forms of rapid transit increases usership, which is not surprising, right? But the bulk of these use comes from substitution away from other forms of public transportation, like buses and these little kind of peseros that are much less effective forms of transportation. However, if we look a little bit more in detail, we find that if you look at these 2 separate forms of rapid transit, so if you look at metro separately from BRT, we find that individuals that find themselves closer to a BRT station do substitute away from vehicles towards BRT. So we find some substitution away from BRT when we look at it separately from the subway. And one of the most interesting findings is that there is an additional effect from being close to both a station of the subway and a station of the BRT. And this is one finding that is quite intriguing to us, and to which we want to devote quite a bit of the kind of follow-up research in this paper. So to put it kind of in more simple terms, if you are in proximity of both modes of transportation, then you have an additional effect in terms of substitution away from vehicles above and beyond what you would have if you were exposed to a single of these modes of transportation. And then with respect to the heterogeneity in income, what we're finding is that this substitution that I talked about away from other forms of transportation and towards rapid forms of transportation is happening predominantly in the lower and middle income brackets. However, if you look at the higher income brackets of the income distribution, you start finding individuals substituting away from vehicles and towards public transportation. So it is inducing some substitution away from vehicles in the income brackets that are currently the ones that have the lowest use of public transportation, which is very encouraging. So what we want to show here is that the introduction of these forms of transportation does seem like a promising avenue towards slowing down the adoption of vehicles in Mexico City as income continues to increase. All right, so
Paulina, sorry for interrupting you. Santiago has a short question. Please, Santiago.
Hi, Paulina. I just have a clarifying question. When you say substitute away, I envision 3 options of substituting away, and I was wondering if you could separate. The first one is I don't buy a car. Mm-hmm. The second one is I sell a car that I already had. And the third one is I have the car, but I don't use it during the week and I use it in the weekend. So I change the usage. Can you separate on whether we manage people that had cars not to use it, or we prevent people from buying cars?
So that's an excellent question, and I'll get to that in a little bit more detail. What we have, the measure that we have currently, it's sort of grouping all of this at once. So the measure is specifically whether it's at the individual level or at the household level. And the measure is at whether in your set of modes of transportation you have vehicle or not. So it is overall use of vehicle. We don't know whether the family owns a vehicle. We don't have that information for all the years, but we do know whether among all the forms of transportation that you use, you're using a vehicle. So to some extent, it is including, if you have a vehicle, you probably use it. So in my view, it's including some of that ownership, which is exactly what we want to get at. We want to get at this sort of pseudo-permanent substitution away from vehicles and towards forms of public transportation. Of course, there's also going to be that intensive margin included in the measure that we use. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our data. The data is quite detailed. So the data comes from these origin destination surveys that Mexico City had in a few years.
Sorry, Paulina, I can interrupt.
Sure.
It's a follow-up question to Santiago's. So at the end, you guys have an effect in terms of vehicle use, not in terms of miles driven, for instance. You guys cannot tell whether more cars are being driven.
Correct. Not for now. We will be able to look at that dimension we have the miles driven in the data. For now, the result that we're focusing on is the different modes. So the modes you use.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. And the reason, let me just say one more note. The reason is because the research question that we're particularly interested is whether you can shift with these public transportation interventions, you can shift people away from using a vehicle towards using public forms of public transportation. So that is sort of the question of interest, whether you can create new users of public transportation through these public transportation interventions. All right, so as I said, the data comes from these very rich origin destination surveys in Mexico that started in 1994 and had a couple more waves of them in 2007 and 2017. These are very, very rich surveys that have trip-level data and include mode, time, origin, and destination information. So eventually we'll be able to get also this intensive margin as well. And it also has rich information in terms of the residential location, much more specific in terms of the origin and a little bit less specific in terms of the destination, but we were able to get quite detailed information about these trips, as well as some rich information on demographic. Now I'm going to skip you through the details of how we made the surveys compatible, which is, all the credit goes to my co-authors, and this was a year-long process of trying to make them compatible, because obviously they were not made to be used together. But we managed to create a pseudo panel or a panel of origins and destinations using these three waves of surveys, so that we can learn about how the different interventions that came along in between 1994 and 2007, and in between 2007 and 2017, change the behavior in terms of transportation. All right, so let me give you a quick overview of how these different lines were added over time. So let's start with the yellow lines. These are the old lines, so the lines that were present before our first survey. Sorry, not the yellow lines, the black lines before 1994. So 1994 is sort of the old network of Metro. And then after 1994, we see these three lines of Metro being added, which are the yellow lines. And then after 1994, we see all the lines of Metrobus being added also to the network. So these are the blue lines. So as you can see, it's a pretty rich network. And we can see that in terms of the survey that we have, I'm sorry. Let me move this for a second. We're gonna be able to show data that corresponds to 2,500 tracts, and these are the gray tracts in the map. These are the tracts that we were able to match across surveys. This is going to correspond to about 200,000 people, and 500,000, a little bit under 500,000 non-walking trips. I'm going to skip a little bit over the Plan Maestro for now. I'll talk about it when we get to the identification issues. And let me dive a little bit into some statistics to show more or less what is the usership of the public transportation in Mexico City, and how has it evolved over time. So public transit is by far the predominant form of transportation in Mexico City still today. So as you can see here, in 1994 we had that about 77% of people use public transit as their main form of public transportation, and that has been falling over time, but not by a lot. So it's still close to 70% or 65% of people who use public forms of transportation. And as you can see, the predominant mode of transportation is still this bus or colectivo mode, which are not as efficient as the Metrobus and the BRT, sorry, as the Metro and the BRT or the Metrobus. So you can see also how has private vehicle use evolved over time. It has been steadily increasing over these years. However, it's still not the predominant form of transportation, which tells us that there's quite a bit of room to maintain the usership of public transportation in Mexico City, and reduce the quick adoption of private vehicles. So the other thing that I wanted to show here is how the travel time has evolved over time. And as you can see here for all in this bottom row, it has increased for all modes of transportation. You can also look at that individually, but it has disproportionately increased for private vehicles. So there are some sort of good reasons why individuals may want to also shift to transit. Now, as you can see, the travel times for public transit are still larger than those of private vehicles. And finally, I just wanted to draw attention to the multimodal trips. So the great majority of trips, about 80%, consist of one single mode, but there is about 20% of those trips that include more than one mode. All right, so then let's talk a little bit about this correlation between income and vehicle use for the case of Mexico City. I showed a bunch of graphs for different countries, and now we can take a look at what's happening in Mexico City. Now, one issue with income that we had to overcome is that both the 1994 and the 2007 surveys had information on income, but the last survey, the 2017 survey, didn't have income. So what we did is we used a mapping that we created between characteristics and income with the other surveys, and also with the help of the census surveys, to try and predict income for 2017. And to be consistent, we use predicted income throughout across all surveys. And here you can see sort of what's kind of the difference between using predicted income and using actual income. So the dotted lines are which are only available for the first 2 years of the survey correspond to the actual income, and the solid lines correspond to the predicted income. So the two things that I want to draw attention to here is that the sort of biggest increase of vehicle use among the highest income groups occurred between 1994 and 2007. So it's this jump between the gray line and the blue line. And according to our data, there wasn't that big of a jump in between the 2007 and 2017 waves of data. So it slowed down already quite a bit, maybe because of this introduction of forms of public transportation, although at this point we cannot draw any causal conclusions. All right, so let me talk a little bit about our analysis, which for now, what I'm going to show today is still exploratory. We're still moving towards better forms of identification, better strategies of identification, and also more in-depth looks at the mechanisms behind the findings that we have. So for now, take these results with a grain of salt. I'll tell you all about kind of what are our current identification concerns and how are we planning to solve them. So for now, what we're going to estimate is a two-way fixed effects model for mode J. And this is where I get to talk a lot about what is our measure of mode. So this set YIT is a set of mode that individual I takes across all trips in each survey wave. And we're gonna, our dependent variable is an indicator for whether a particular mode, let's say vehicle or public transit, is in that set. Okay. So for example, if J is vehicle, this is going to take the value of 1 if the individual has used a vehicle across all the trips that are registered in that wave of the survey. Okay. Then our main right-hand side variable of interest is this measure of proximity that is going to vary at the tract level. So this C subscript I, it's the tract that individual I lives in. Sometimes it's going to be referring to the destination, but more often it's going to be referring to the origin, so where the individual starts a trip. The way we construct this variable is as a measure of proximity that decays as you get further away from the station. And more specifically, I have here the exact equation. Is going to be is going to take the value of 1 if you live basically in the same location as the station, and is going to decay linearly until you get 2 kilometers away from the station, and then it's going to be 0 at distances that are longer than that. Does that sort of make sense? So it's really a measure of proximity, and it's between 0 and 1. If you're right next to the station, is 1. If you are 2 kilometers or further away, it's going to take the value of 0. And XIT are going to be the individual level characteristics, and we're also going to have tract specific fixed effects, tract by mode fixed effects, and tract by wave fixed effects. All right, so
Paulina, sorry for interrupting you. Just
Sure.
a quick question. How do you deal with when a user is taking several types of modes for the total trip? For instance, take a bus, take a bus, and then metro, and then maybe motorbikes or private vehicle and so on.
Yeah, so that would take, for example, if let's say you take a taxi and then you get to the taxi to the metro, then these would take the value of 1 for both the taxi and for the metro. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, thank you.
All right, so, okay, so then let me just make one final note. Let me talk a second about the causal interpretation, and then I'll talk about one final notation note. With this specification, we think that we're getting rid of some sources of unobserved determinants of mode use, but not all of them. So we are identified of basically changes in proximity driven by the arrival of these stations. We have some threats to identification that could come from either people sorting, right, across locations because of the arrival of these stations. So individuals moving closer to a station or public transportation users, right, moving closer to interventions, or also endogenous location of these stations. And I'll talk a little bit more about these threats in a second. So the last note or notation that I wanted to make is that we're sometimes going to be looking at proximity to any form of rapid transit, and this is going to include subway and BRT. And sometimes we're going to be looking at this proximity individually by different modes. All right, so these are the two threats of identification that I mentioned: sorting or general equilibrium effects. In our strategy to look at this for now, because we're not going to be modeling individuals' location endogenously, is to look at changes in demographics. If we observe that there are substantial changes in demographics in places that receive the stations, then we would be concerned about some of our effects being driven by sorting of these general equilibrium effects. The second potential endogeneity concern is endogenous placement of stations. This would occur, for example, if planners are forecasting the transit use, and if they see, for example, the transit use is already increasing in a certain location, and then decide to place a station in that location, then we would be attributing the effect of the location of the station to the pre-existing trend. Okay, so that is the other concern that we have. And in this one, we have a plan and some kind of very preliminary results. For now, I'll show you mainly the plan because the results are still very preliminary. But what we're using is basically trying to find better controls for those tracts, taking advantage of the pre-existing plans for the locations of these lands. And I'll tell you a little bit about it in a few slides if we have time. All right, so let me get to the results so that we can get to the fun part. So first, the results on proximity. Okay, so these are sort of the results that we would have predicted if you find yourself located in proximity to a rapid transit station, either Metrobus or subway. You're about 20% more likely to use that rapid transit. Okay, or 18% more likely. Remember that our left-hand side variable is a dummy variable. And remember how proximity is measured. This variable takes the value of 1 if you're literally right next to the station. So if you want to know how much does it change, how much does use of rapid transit change if you're 1 kilometer away, then you kind of have this, coefficient and you get like a 9.3% more likely. Okay, so then when we look at transit, though, we see that proximity to rapid transit is not making you use public transportation more than you used to before. So when we look at these two modes together, or proximity to both stations together, we don't find really any additional public transit users by this measure. Instead, what we're finding is that most of the substitution is coming from other forms of public transportation that are less efficient. So people that used to use buses or colectivos are now starting to use this rapid or more effective forms of public transportation. And we see very little evidence that people are shifting away from vehicles. So again, this is sort of the result that if you look at both modes together, you find that the bulk of this response is coming from substitution away from other forms of public transportation. So now let me show you the results by mode, and here's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. When we split by mode, then our results become a little bit more precise. And sorry, this is just any rapid transit. So this is sort of the same. Before looking at substitution away, I'm just going to look at the use of rapid transit by proximity to these independent stations, and the results are very similar to what we saw before. If you find yourself now close to a new subway station, then you increase your usership of rapid transit by about 17% and by 11% with a BRT station. There's a little bit of substitution between the two modes, but not a whole lot. All right, so now let me look at what's happening with the other modes of transportation as you find yourself closer to these stations. So first, note that the if you find yourself close to a new subway station, you are unlikely to become a new user of transit, right? So it's still not the case that subways are drawing new users to public transportation. However, we do find a positive coefficient in not a trivial amounts. So if you find yourself near a BRT station, you're 6% more likely to use any form of transportation in your trips. And the other interesting result that we find is that there is this additional effect of finding yourself near both. That is also going to show in the vehicle use. So if you find yourself near both a subway station and a BRT station, you're 5% more likely than to use a public form of transportation, which is above and beyond being close to a single one of these. Okay. So now we can look at what's happening with vehicles, and the results with vehicles are mirroring what's happening with the results of public transportation. So again, not a lot of evidence that people are substituting away from forms of public transportation towards vehicles. If you end up with a new subway station near your origin. However, if you end up with a new BRT station near your origin, you are about 5% less likely to use vehicle among your modes of transportation. And again, we find this additional effect of being near both, which we find quite interesting. So if you end up near both a subway station and a BRT station, you have an extra 7% increase in your probability of using, a 7% decrease in your probability of using vehicle, which goes above and beyond the effect of being close to a single one of these modes. Okay, so what do we make of these results? What is the interpretation of this? So we have a couple of ideas on what is driving this result of adoption or disadoption of vehicles when you are close to both of these stations. One has to do with just sort of accessibility, this measure of market access that has now become really popular in urban economics, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So perhaps there's something about being close to two stations that increases overall your market access, and that is driving this result. The other explanation, which could be part of the macro axis, but it's a little bit more specific, has to do with independent shocks to the different modes of transportation. So let's think about an individual that is considering whether or not to have a vehicle as a backup for when there's some big issue with the public transportation, right? Or specifically with metro, which we know there's often some big problem with that. So this individual may be less inclined to have the vehicle as their backup option if they have another form of transportation that's available to them as a plan B, right? As a way to hedge against shocks to their primary mode of transportation. So maybe what's happening here is that if you offer a portfolio of choices in terms of modes of transportation to individuals, then they have less of a use for car as their backup mode of transportation. Okay, so that's an interpretation that we would like to look at it by formally modeling the mode use, and specifically making sure that we allow the different forms of transportation to have independent shocks, because this interpretation as a way to hedge against shocks would rely on these modes of transportation having independent shocks at a single time. All right, so let's now dive a little bit into income. What we want to know is whether the adoption of vehicle changes at different levels of income. So what we're going to look at is compare the difference in treatment effects across different income beams. And it's easier to do this in graphs, so I'm just going to show you quickly some of the graphs. I'm looking at the time. I know that we're quickly running out of our 45 minutes, so I'll speed up. So first of all, note that if you find yourself closer to a station, to a rapid transit station, and this includes both subway and Metrobus, your probability of using rapid transit increases at all income brackets, so at all income ranks. However, you can see here, and maybe it's perhaps a little bit easier to see in this graph that is showing the difference between those, between being close and far away, that the difference is higher for lower and middle income groups than for higher income groups. Okay, so that's just the effect of proximity. So now let's look at the use of public transit by income. And what you see here is that at lower levels of income, there's not an effect on the use of public transportation, only at the higher levels of income. And again, I'm showing here the difference between the two lines to make it a little bit more easy to see. So this substitution away from other forms of public transportation towards rapid transit that we saw in some of our results turns out that it's happening predominantly for lower and middle income groups. And we see that among those higher income groups, some people are opting for public transportation and away from vehicle. And I can show you that the mirror image of that, which corresponds to vehicle use, right? So if you look at vehicle use, you see exactly the same result. It's not inducing the proximity to the stations is not inducing less use of vehicle among lower and middle income groups, but it is inducing less vehicle use among the higher income groups. All right, so I'm running out of time, so I don't know if we'll have time to look at to talk at length about kind of our plan for improving the identification for now. I'll just say that we're kind of improving our treatment and control groups, and I'm happy to talk about it offline to anybody interested. What I would love to give you just a little bit of a taste and then just conclude is where are we going next with this? And this is, let me get, I think I had it here. Where we're going next is trying to better understand what are the mechanisms behind these effects that we find. And we have several hypotheses, and here's where we would love to get some feedback from you, especially since maybe some in the audience have actually been using some of these modes of transportation in either Mexico City or Colombia. So what we think are some possible explanations for these findings. Why is BRT more effective at bringing people to public transportation? Well, one kind of simple explanation is that the BRT actually makes driving worse by taking away some lanes. And we can actually test a little bit of this with some of the data we have already, so I can show you those results. But another hypothesis that we have is whether the BRT is serving a kind of like an entryway into public transportation for those that haven't tried it before. So we know that there are some people in the higher income brackets that have not experienced public transportation before, and perhaps when they find themselves close to this very convenient form of transportation, become introduced to public transportation, and it's sort of like their entryway into this system. So that's another hypothesis that we have. Whereas the subway for some reason doesn't have that effect. It's not innovative enough, or it doesn't look as pretty, whatever the reason is. And the other kind of interesting finding that we see is this kind of additional response when people find themselves close to multiple rapid transit modes. And to this, we have a couple of hypotheses. One is just market access is further expanded by having access to these multiple modes. But then the second one is related to these independent shocks. Our shocks across modes uncorrelated enough that using vehicle as a backup is now less attractive. So I'm not going to have time to discuss a whole lot of this, but the way that we have planned in order to dive into some of this explanation, especially these two, the last two, is by formally modeling, by structurally modeling the choice of mode conditional on origin and destination, and trying to create a measure of market access and seeing how this measure of market access changes with the introduction of these stations, of these new stations.
Paulina, sorry for interrupting you.
Sure.
5 minutes to have some time for discussion,
Sure.
please.
Yeah, so I'll let me then just conclude with the summary of our results, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit more during the questions about some of these things that I just barely touched upon. So what we find is that when one brings this new origin destination service together, we can study what happens to the uses of the use of public transportation as we introduce new modes of public transportation. And what we find is a lot of substitution from other transit and more lower income earners, but we find suggestive evidence that new forms of rapid transit are helping bring these middle to high income individuals into using public transportation, and that access to multiple modes is going to play an important role in substituting away from vehicles. We are working on improving the identification by finding better control group for those treated tracts, and also on exploring some of the mechanisms that could be behind these results. All right, so I'll open it to questions, so we have some time for that.
Thank you, Paulina. Great presentation. We have some couple of questions in the audience. I think maybe Chris has answered the question. It's about those who are substituting vehicles to public transport. What is the kind of the purpose of the trip? If they going to work or is going to study or any other, or just traveling for taking care of their kids, or what is the kind of purpose of the trip?
So for now it's all trips, because the survey includes all trips, but we have the specific purpose of trips in the data. So we're going to be able to see whether the response is heterogeneous across different purposes of trips as well. What we're thinking we're going to do, when I mentioned this measure of market access, one thing that we're going to try and do with a measure of market access is creating a measure of market access to the labor market, right? Using those trips that are only for work purposes, and a measure of market access to retail. So using those trips that have the purpose of other things. So we'll be able to see what is driving these effects, which is very exciting.
Okay, thank you. I would like to give the word to Ariester. Please ask directly the question. I think the question is very interesting.
Hi, very nice paper, very nice presentation. My question has to do with harassment, the possibility of harassment, and also safety when it comes to either BRT and subway. I live in São Paulo, for example, and depending on the subway line we are talking about, if it's a concession, for example, you see more policemen and policewomen, as opposed to situations where you'd, for example, take a bus downtown and you would not see the same type of police enforcement. Would that play a role when differentiating those two in Mexico City?
Excellent question. I think that there are definitely safety concerns in Mexico City. I haven't really thought about the differences across modes. What we know, for example, is that Metro does this thing of devoting the first few cars to women only, so that they feel safer. So there are measures that the subway, for example, adopts so that it feels safer for women, which could be a consideration for women to then use one mode versus the other. And you know, again, the one thing, and this question about safety has come up in also a previous presentation. one thing that we could do is we could try and incorporate some of the crime data from Mexico City, and also to try and see if there are any gender differences using.
I was going to ask that if you have information on gender in your origin destination research.
Yes,
okay.
we do.
Thank
you. We have other 3 questions. I would like to give the word to Hernan, please.
Hola, Paulina. Hi. Thank you. Excellent presentation and super interesting work. I think that I have 2 types of questions, and I will try to be brief. I promise not to cantinflar so much. Let me try to structure them in this way, because it's mostly important, I think, if you are going to go on the structural way, to think about the fundamentals of the problem. And the way that I see this is like, I don't know why not too many people cite the initial big congestion pricing model, because actually it is a model of commuting. And I think that there the important is like the value that you get for arriving late or arriving early, or even the mean of the trip. It's important. And the way that I see this in my theoretical mind is like these interventions, what they do in some way, they modify the strategy space of the commuters. And they modify the strategy space of the commuters in a heterogeneous way. So those ones that live closer or like have an action added to the strategy space, and those that live farther have they don't have this action added. 2 things related to this, like, so 2017 has like an exogenous variation with the introduction of ride sharing and like other modes of like last mile commuting. So I don't know how that is incorporated in the model or the analysis. So the first part is that. The second part is it modifies it, even if you live close or you live late, it modifies it differently for people that has, even with the same income level, kind of like time flexibility to travel at different times of the day or to go to work at different times of the day and stuff like that. And I don't know if you have ways to incorporate these characteristics into the analysis. And last is like related to this is like building infrastructure, even subway is super expensive, or BRT, it's maybe less expensive, but it's expensive. So when you are going to do a cost benefits analysis or a welfare analysis, this will play a very big role, no? So there are other kind of like interventions that are less costly in terms of infrastructure, that they also modify the fundamentals of the problem, meaning adding actions to the strategy space of the commuters. I don't know if you guys have thought anything of that.
Yeah, this is a complex question that you asked, and I really appreciate it because we are getting to this model relatively soon, and these are all very important considerations to incorporate. We are in the process of generating counterfactual travel times using in the presence and absence of these modes in order to be able to generate to be able to estimate this structural model of modes of use. And if I understood correctly, what you're saying is that there might be some sort of like non-linearities with distance in terms of the characteristics of the modes, right? That I think we definitely should pay attention to. And we can explore that a little bit using the reduced form analysis and then try and figure out how to do that. But I'll follow you with, I'll follow up with you, Hernan, to make sure that I understood your comments correctly. And yeah,
sí,
on the welfare.
En español estaba pensando, it's not the same for me than maybe a doctor that earns the same income than me, but I only have like 2 times that I have to go to see them. It's when I have to teach. Then I can travel, I can choose like whenever I want, and it's different for me, the introduction of a metro system, of a BRT system close by home, than for a doctor. And yeah.
Okay, so something that we can do, we had thought about introducing these measures of market access, making these measures of market access heterogeneous by income, because it's different, as you say, that the type of access that you need, right, when you have a higher income is different than when you have a lower income. But you're drawing attention to other potential forms of heterogeneity, even with an income that we may want to do this. And I think we could do that by generating some of these market access measures or modeling this sort of market access separately for different groups. I forget if we have, and then I may know this better than I do, any data on occupation or other information that could give us a little bit more heterogeneity on that.
We have, thank you, Paulina. We have 2 extra questions. Please, Natalie.
Thank you, Jorge. Hi, Paulina. Very nice project. So I have one comment / suggestions. Of course, you guys see if you take it or not, and the other is a question. I was thinking about the work by Gallego and Salas and co-authors on the heterogeneous effect over time of transport policies, right, for Mexico City and Santiago. And then they find that any sort of effect may die out over time. And because you guys here are averaging out across a lot of years, and rapid transit has limited capacity, I wonder if you guys could explore whether this reduction in vehicle use is just temporary, and then at the end, we may see an increase at the end, or well, at least it may disappear. And the second question, it's sort of related to the idea of market access. And I'm thinking just in the case, again, of Santiago, when you have a new subway station, you bring together also a lot of, small businesses and things that tend to happen around that station that may increase congestion around. So I wonder, even though it may be an indirect effect, right? Maybe reduction in vehicle use is due to this indirect effect of increasing congestion around that area. Mm-hmm. And maybe I missed something in the strategy, in the empirical strategy, but yeah, I wonder if you guys can say something about congestion around these rapid transit stations. Thank you.
Excellent questions. So I'll get to the last one first. We actually find some evidence that's consistent with what you're suggesting. So didn't have time to show you, but we look at travel time as an outcome variable. And we find that if you end up that travel time in vehicle increases when a BRT station is created near your origin. And it is very much this congestion at the station, because when we look at routes, so we looked at this because we were concerned that a bulk of the effect was of BRT was driven by the BRT taking a lane away from traffic.
Right.
However, when we look at routes that are treated on both ends by BRT stations, we find no effect. So it's really at the origin that seems to be creating congestion for vehicles. So we have some evidence for that in the reduced form. We still need to think about it, how to incorporate that with the structural work. And in terms of the effect of rapid transit dying over time, what I will say for now is that because of the data that we have, which is we don't have mode use immediately after the creation of these stations, right? Because the introduction of the stations is happening throughout the years in between these very kind of spaced out waves, right? So my intuition says that if this was dying quickly over time, we would be finding nothing. Because we're not looking at mode that's immediately post introduction of these stations. What we can do is we can try and differentiate the effects by the length of time that has happened since the station has been introduced, and try to explore that.
Thanks, Paulina.
Thank
you. Alejandro, you have another question, please.
Thank you. Hi, Paulina. Very nice project and presentation. I have a question and a comment related to that. I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, but the data you use is at the household level or individual level? Because I was thinking, okay, maybe
we have both, but the one that I actually don't remember. I think that this is, Dana, do you remember if these results the results that I presented are at the individual or the household level. I think they are at the individual level. I think we have
Yes.
some other results at the household level.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, so the variable that we created is at the individual level, but we can also do it at the household level.
Okay, I'm asking because if I start using any transit, I leave my car available for someone else in my household, right? So I was wondering about that. And that's related with the effect you found on the interaction between BRT and Metro. And I think that they don't run parallel to each other all the time, right? So you have access to more areas in the city when you live close to both. And I believe that makes you less dependent of your car. So it's more likely that you start riding regularly one of these modes of transport instead of your car. And then that's why I ask about the household level data, because if I'm less dependent, but I don't know, my brother isn't, he can take my car, and I don't know how would you estimate the effects, the substitution effect in that case.
Yeah, so for the household level, we can just use at the household, we can just look at the household level instead, and we have those results, but I actually don't remember exactly what we get on those. My broad sense is that they were broadly consistent. So we can create the variable at the household level in order to see whether it's just kind of shifting hands, right, from one member of the household to the other. And in terms of the what you're saying, the potential role of these, the interaction effect and the potential role of these lines not running parallel, there is one case in which they're running parallel, and you probably know which one is, and is in Insurgentes, right? So the structural model would allow us precisely to be able to differentiate between those potential explanations, right? The explanation of being able to drive to many more places in the city would be incorporated in this measure of market access, even if we don't allow for independent shocks to the different modes of transportation, right? So if we can sort of replicate what we see, right, in terms of behavior without the independent shocks, then it would be driven mainly by increasing market access. But if we find that these independent shocks play an important role in terms of explaining why public transportation becomes all of a sudden more attractive, then the mechanism will be also related to this shock. So that's why the structural model is key for trying to think about these mechanisms.
Thanks, Paulina. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I would like to end the discussion with one comment and one question from me. The comment is related to the system in Colombia about Transmilenio. You know, Transmilenio have been built since 2000, and now it's almost 20 years working in the city. And I think if this would happen if I would try to internalize the results in Transmilenio, I would say that some of the reasons why some people of high income try to take the bus close to the station is because these buses have their own lane. So when they have their own lane, it's just, and it's very quick. So if you compare all the transport modes in the city, and especially for very long distances, Bogota is a very long city, and people transporting from the south, from the north, the average time is around 50 minutes. And 50 minutes in this very long distance is a very good deal for many people. So it means that the own lanes and the very short transport time is a good incentive for people just to take the bus. That is one thing. And another comment related with it is that with another project that we were working with some colleagues in Universidad de los Andes, realized that one way to characterize income from people is just when you say close to the station, but just in the morning peak. Because in the morning peak, we know that they actually have several constraints at the same time, and you can see perhaps the estimates that you can find would be larger, you know, during the morning peak. And so it means that perhaps your estimates are an average of the day or an average over time. But if you see that, especially when people value more time, would be very important. So it would be nice just to see during the morning peak between 5 a.m. To 9 a.m., for instance. And my last question is about what could be your suggestion for Latin American cities with this kind of public transport, the BRT? What's your about the experience that you have? So now we have this in Bogota, in several cities in Colombia too. And you know that during the pandemic, we have been facing several problems about the financial situation of these programs. So how do you extrapolate your results to any other BRT system in Latin America?
Thank you so much for your question. I'll start with the last one, which is the hardest. I'm going to be a good economist and say it depends. we don't quite know yet, and I wouldn't feel until we kind of dive into the mechanisms. I wouldn't feel comfortable drawing conclusions to this, because it's critical to understand why is it that we're seeing these effects. Is it because market access? If it's market access, right, it's not necessarily the case that is what Hernan was saying. You know, there might be cheaper interventions that can increase market access, right? That can yield the same result. However, if it is something like the effect that I was mentioning before, if it is because these new innovative modes of transportation are bringing in new income groups into the system, right? Then it might be worthwhile, right? Then the externalities might be that you create by having this new adopters of the system join the public transportation system, that it might be worthwhile to include them. So I think until we dive into the mechanisms, I think we're not super comfortable making policy recommendations in terms of what is, you know, if your goal is to reduce vehicle adoption, what is kind of the way forward, which is the question that I'm trying to answer. And let me ask a follow-up question to your morning peak question. Is it about your interest in the specific trips is because of the, so you think that the value of time is different depending on the trip's purpose or the time of day?
It could be both, but I think so during the time, it could be both. But yes, but in general, you know, people travel because of work, because of to study, but the main constraint is during the morning peak. So people value a lot. So what I mean is, to arrive 5 minutes late to your work and during the morning, or it's very complicated, because when we analyze the demand profile, we see that during the morning peak, the profile is very short. So you see the graph is very short time, but a lot of demand during the short time. Yeah. But during the afternoon, people don't coordinate each other just to leave their work, to leave the schools at the same time. So people can leave their work at different times, but during the morning, all people want to use the road space. So that's why I think the value of time at that is very important.
Yeah, I think you make I was asking about the mode because we have a good handle on the differences, so we're going to be able to capture well differences in value of time depending on the mode of on the purpose of the trip. Congestion is going to be a little bit trickier, but we have travel time, but we're going to have to. What we need to do, and this is sort of what is in the works, is to be able to generate counterfactual travel times with and without these different modes that were introduced, or these different stations that were introduced, and account for congestion at different times of the day, which is going to be tricky. So right now, this is kind of our project for the next few months, to be able to generate this counterfactual terms, and you're drawing attention to a dimension of heterogeneity that's going to be tricky to incorporate, but as you say, very, very important to incorporate.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So Paulina, thank you very much for your time, and Danae, thank you also, and Chris for this interesting work. So we are so happy to have you here. So maybe Irving has a last question. So please, 1 minute.
Yeah, happy to have it.
Irving, and I think he's not listening to me. So,
No, but Natalie, I think Natalie has a question instead.
If you guys want one more questions, I may ask one more.
okay,
So
yes, please.
it's related with a comment that I saw in the chat too. It's very surprising to see that effect among high income groups, right? And not among low income groups, right? Did I get it right? There is no effect among low income groups.
Yes, there's no effect substituting away from vehicle.
Vehicle, yes.
Let me show you.
I know that there are many externalities related to vehicle use, right? So if you think about congestions, this result is, good anyways, right? But if I care more about emissions, we know that high income people is more likely to buy, for instance, more efficient cars, or I don't know, it could be like hybrid cars nowadays. So do I really want to see if the policy, if I care about, again, emissions, do I really want to see these effects among high income groups?
That is a good question. We haven't drawn the parallel between vehicle use and emissions yet. That's still in our to-do list. I would say that this pattern that we're finding is not surprising when you see the share of individuals in Mexico City that use public transportation. Remember that about 70% of people in Mexico City use public forms of transportation predominantly, and they're obviously concentrated in the low income groups. So vehicle use among these low and middle income groups is very low. From that perspective, it's not super surprising that there's just not a lot. Since it's very low already, there's not a way to further reduce it for these groups. So the only way to increase usership of public transportation is by drawing upon the income groups that are currently not using public forms of transportation. So in terms of whether these are going to be cleaner vehicles, what I do know about Mexico is that the adoption of hybrids and electrics is low, and the other consideration is that vehicles remain in the road for a very long time, for a much longer time than in the US, for example. So all vehicles end up being very highly polluting as well. And finally, if one of the things that you think about is congestion, then even if emissions, which again, we haven't drawn exactly parallel, so we don't know the answer to that. But even if emissions are not a concern, congestion might be a consideration as well.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah, I personally care more about emissions, so that's what I was asking.
Yeah, no, but it is that question, right? So we motivated this talk by saying, that as incomes increase, emissions become a higher percent. Sorry, emissions coming from transportation become a higher percentage of overall emissions. And the question is this because of private forms of transportation? And if it is, how many emissions are we going to avoid by encouraging the use of
Thank you. Thank you, Paulina.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, everybody, for this time here in the presentation. We learned many things from you, Paulina and I, and your co-authors. So thank you very much. Thanks for the organizers of this event. So have a nice day, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for your comments. They were super useful. We took notes of it. So we might follow up with some of you later on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.